So let's jump back over into the code. And I'm going to jump back over into our airline component. And the first thing that I want to do here is I want to create a new airline object in our state that we can use to basically make that API request to our API endpoint and then grab the data for the specific airline, and then we can update our state and add it to this airline object. So similar to what we did in our airlines component, I'm going to actually import use state and use effect from React. And then what we can do is inside of our airline component, I'm going to create a new airline variable and a set airline variable. And we're just going to set that equal to use state. And initially, we're just going to make this into an empty object. And then I also want to create an object in my state for review as well. So I'm going to do review and set review. And I want to make this an empty object as well. But basically, what we'll do is once we add the review form into this page, when a user starts filling that out to add a new review, we can just map that to this review object in our state and then just use that to create new reviews for this airline. So what I want to do next then is similar to what we did in our airlines component. I'm going to use effect, and then inside of that, I'm going to create an arrow function. And basically what we can do is inside of here, we can actually make the API request to our API endpoint to get the data for this airline. So in order to do that though, recall that for our API endpoint, the way that we have it structured right now is basically like API v1 and then airlines, and then it's going to be the actual slug for the airline. So it'll be something like United Airlines. So in order to be able to make our API request for each airline, we need to figure out a way to get that slug value so that we can actually construct the URL for our API endpoint. So one way that we can do this is because we structured the routes on the React side of our app to be something like airlines/United Airlines. So basically they map pretty closely to the way that we structured our API URL. We can actually just grab that value from the URL and use that to construct the URL for our API endpoint. And so in order to get that value, one way that we can do that is if we pass props down to this component, we can actually get that value from props. So just as an example, let's just console log props inside of use effect. And I'm also just going to pass an empty array as a second argument to make sure that this only runs once. But let's console log props and let's jump over to the browser and just take a look at what that looks like. So I'm going to reload the page. So you can see that props got logged to the console. And for this example, we're trying to get the slug for United Airlines. So if we look at the values we have in props, if we open this up, if we look in match and then params, we can see in here we have this value of slug that maps to our slug value in the URL. So what we can actually do is basically just do props and then get match param slug to get that value, and then use that to actually construct the URL that we need for our API endpoint. So I'm going to create a new variable in here and just call this slug. And I'm just going to set that equal to props.match.params.slug. And so what we can do now is with that, we can actually construct the URL for our API endpoint. So we can do const URL and set that equal to, we can basically just use backticks and do string interpolation. So we can do /API/v1/airlines, then we can do /slug to actually set that slug value for the URL. And then with that, we can actually go ahead and just make our API request using Axios. So I'm going to import Axios into this component. And then what we can do is basically just do axios.get. And now we can pass in that URL, and then we can just chain on our .then and .catch cases. And for both of these, I'm just going to console log the response. So let's go ahead and let's go back over to our browser and reload the page and see if that API request goes through. Cool. So we can see that we made our request and we're getting a response back, and now we're logging that to the console. So in this case, we're making the request to API v1 airlines United Airlines. And if we look in the data that we get back, we can see we have this data object, and then inside of that we have the expected API format. So we can see we have all of our attributes, and then we also have an included key that has an array of reviews for this airline. So what I want to do now is take the data that we're getting back from our API and actually use that to update my airline object in our state. So what we can do is just, instead of console logging that there, we can just do, we can use that set airline variable that we get from using useState. We can basically just say set airline to be response.data. And so if we look back at this, we'll basically just take this whole object and store that under airline in our state. And so with that, now we can actually start to build out our page. So down here, I'm going to get rid of that placeholder text. And I'm just going to wrap this in parentheses. But then what we can do is actually start to build out the structure of our page here. So for this outer class, I'm just going to give this like a wrapper class. So I'm just going to give this a class and call it wrapper. And then what I want to do is inside of this, I want to actually create basically two columns. So I'm going to create a div here and give it a class name of column. And then I'm also just going to create a second column. So we'll structure this to basically be our left-right layout. So then in the left side, I want to basically create a header section where we're going to have all of our information for the airline. And then underneath that, I want to create a list where we'll show all of the existing reviews for that airline. And then in the right, I want to create basically just a review form. So for now, we'll just call that review form, and then I'll add a little bit of placeholder content just so we know that our review form is going to go there momentarily. And then for our header content, I actually want to move this to its own component inside of our airline directory here. So I'm just going to create a new file and call it header.js. And then inside of this, let's actually import React from React. And let's create a new component and just call it header. And this will take props as an argument. And then inside of this, we can return the structure of our header and then bring that back into airline. So for this, I'm going to also create like a little wrapper class here. And so in here, I want to add like an H1 where we can add basically the name of the airline. And I also want to add an image tag in here where we can bring in the airline's logo momentarily. So we'll have the logo here, and then we'll also have the airline name. And then underneath that, let's create just a little container div. And in here, I want to basically add the total reviews for an airline. And I also want to add basically like the star rating. And I also want to add like total out of. And this will basically be like a display of the total average score out of 5. So let's export that. And then back over in airline, let's import that. And then down here we have this header section. We can actually just replace that with header. And then what I want to do is basically, now that we're setting the value from our API response in that airline object, we should be able to just pass down attributes as props to our header by calling airline.data.attributes. But one thing that's going to potentially start to get annoying here is because we're dealing with these like deeply nested attributes, if we try to call attributes on data before we've actually set the value for our airline object, then this is going to start to throw like a bunch of errors. So one way that we can try to avoid that is I'm actually going to create another value in our state, and I'm just going to set a loaded value. So I'm going to create two variables. I'm going to create loaded and set loaded, and basically I want to just use our useState hook and just set that as like a simple Boolean value. So initially I'm just going to set that to be false. And then what we can actually do is once we get the response back from our API, so once we've made our API request and we get a successful response back, we can actually, along with updating airline in our state, we can actually also update the loaded value in our state and just switch that to true. So we can basically just use that Boolean as a switch to let us know when we actually have our data and when we can actually load in our header component basically. So what we can do is down here, I'm just going to add loaded and basically just say loaded and header. And so we can basically just use that as a check to let us know that we've made our API request and now we have the data that we want to pass down to our header component. So now back over in header, what we can do is basically just take that attributes value and we can use object destructuring to basically just set all the values that we want to grab out of attributes to use inside of this component. So we can basically just set name and image URL and average score and just grab those from props.attributes. And then what we can do is actually start to use these values now inside of our component. So we can actually pass our image URL into the source here. We can also set an alt tag if we want. That would just be the name. And then we can replace airline name with the actual airline name. And then for total reviews, we actually want to grab the total number of reviews for the airline. So we can actually pass that down as well. We can call that like reviews and just say airline.included. And then back over in header, we can just maybe set a total value and just set that equal to props.reviews.length, so we can get the number of reviews for that airline and basically just say like total user reviews, and then star rating I'm going to skip for now, but then we can actually use that average score value to set the average score here as well. So let's jump back over in our browser and take a look and see if that worked. Cool. Okay, so we can see that we're actually starting to populate the page now with that data. So now that we have our data, let's actually pull in styled components and start to do a little bit of styling for this page. So back over in my code, inside of our airline component, let's actually import styled from styled components. And then what we can do is basically just create a new component for each section of our content down here. So I want to create like a wrapper const and set that to be a div. And then I also want to create a column. And then I'm also going to create just like an extra little wrapper around our header that we can use to add some additional style as well. And I'll just call this like main for now. So let's also create a new const and just call that main. Then what I want to do is for my wrapper, so this component will basically be like the container for the entire page. So I'm going to set margin left and margin right auto initially for this. And then what I want to do for this is to build the 2-column layout that I was talking about earlier. I want to actually use CSS grid for this. So I'm going to set the display for our wrapper to grid. And then basically what we can do is say grid template columns, and we can set that equal to repeat 2 and then 1 FR or 1 fractional unit. And so that'll basically set the grid rules for the columns that are going to live inside of our wrapper and set the sort of left-right split that we want to set up for this page. So then inside of our column component here, I want to set up just some basic styling for this. So I'm going to set the default background to be white, and then I'm going to set the height to actually be 100 view height. So just the full height of the page will be the fixed height for our columns. And then I want to set overflow for this to be scroll. So basically as we add more reviews, we'll be able to just scroll down through the column to look at them. And then I want to set some specific styling to our second column. So I want to actually make the background color of that black. And so we could either give that its own dedicated class, or we can actually just target the last child, which will just be the second column in our case. And then we can add specific styling to that as well. So I can say background black for that. And then for this main wrapper around our content on the left, I just want to give it a little bit of padding to push it away from the left wall basically. But what we can do then is actually grab these and just replace them in our content down below. So we can replace that with wrapper, and then for column we can just replace both of these to be our columns. And then we can make this into main. But so now let's actually take a look at that in the browser and see what that looks like. Nice. Okay, so you can see we have this 2-column layout now. We have our content for our header over on the left here, and then on the right, we have this second column where we're going to actually add a review form momentarily. So let's also add some styling now over in our header component as well. So inside of our header component, I'm going to import styled from styled components. And then basically I just want to do the same thing. So I want to create corresponding components to each of the sections in our page here. So I'll create a const wrapper that'll be a div. We also want like total reviews, and then we can also do I'm going to skip star rating again, but we can also do like total out of. And so now for my wrapper, I just want to give this some basic styling to wrap our header section. So I'm going to give this some padding initially, and I'm just going to do like 50 pixels, 100 pixels, 50 pixels, and 0. And then I also want to style the image tag that's inside of our wrapper. And so for this, I want to actually just set like a fixed height and width for this. So I'm going to say height 50 pixels, width 50 pixels. And then I also want to give this a border radius of 100%. And then I also want to just give this like a light border. So I'm going to do 1 pixel solid, and then we can use like RGBA and just use like a low opacity to give that just a light little border. And then I also want to set a font size for our header tag. So I'm going to give this a font size of like 30 pixels. And then we can just grab that and replace it down below. And then for total reviews for this, I'm just going to set like a fixed font size of like 18 pixels. And then we can also just give this like a little bit of padding. And I'm going to do the same thing for total out of. But for this, we could also just give that like a font weight to make it bold, just so it's a little bit different from the text above it. But then let's add those into our content below. And then let's actually take a look and see what that looks like now. Cool. Okay, so it's starting to look a little bit better. Let's actually, I want to try to pull that image down just a little bit. So maybe we can give that a margin bottom of like -8 pixels. And then over in airline, I just want to check that, oh, so this should be, let's see, padding left. So let's refresh that. Okay, so it's starting to look pretty good. I feel like the font size for that is not equal to what I set that at. Let's see if we just move this out of the H1 actually, and just set that for our wrapper and see if that works. Cool. Okay, so that's starting to look pretty good. I'm also actually going to make the image just a little bit bigger for that. So that's starting to look pretty good. So let's start building out our review form next. So back in my code, inside of our airlines folder here, I'm going to create a new file and just call this reviewform.js. And then what we can do in here is import React from React. And then we can create a new component and call it review form. And then we can just export default review form. And then what I want to do in here is just build out a very simple form that we're going to use for creating new reviews for an airline. So I'm going to give this just like a wrapper class. But then what we can do is inside of here, let's actually just build out our form. So my form is going to have like a headline. So we'll have this say, have an experience with, and then we'll end up passing in the airline name. and we'll say share your review. And then what I want to do is just basically create, call this like our field, and inside of this we'll just add all of the inputs that we want to have for our form. So I'm going to have an input with a type of text that's going to be the like headline or title for each review. And then we also are going to want to have a description. And then after that, we're going to want to have basically like a rating kind of container section where we're going to end up adding like a star rating component. So I'm going to call this just our rating container. And then inside of this, we'll have like rating title text. And then once we actually build out our star rating component, that'll go here. But then after that, we just need to add basically like a submit button to actually submit this review. So we've got a type of submit, and we'll say submit your review. But so now let's actually export our review form and then pull that over into our airline component. So we'll import review form from /review form. And then down in our code here, let's actually replace this now with review form. And then actually I want to take this loaded check and actually move it out from this column and actually wrap everything inside of our wrapper with it. So let's pull that down here. But then because we have two top level elements, we actually need to wrap that with something. So we can actually also import fragment from React, and then we can actually wrap our columns down here with fragment. So now let's take a look at that in the browser. Cool. Okay, so now you can see we're actually pulling in our review form over here on the right. Okay, so let's go back over into our airline component, and let's actually create the handle change and handle submit methods that we need to pass down to our review form. So I'm going to create a new constant, just call that handle change. And then I'm going to do the same thing for handle submit. And so basically this handle change method is going to handle basically changes to the input fields within our form. And then handle submit will basically handle what we do when the form is actually submitted. So in both of these, I'm going to pass in E as an argument. And then I'm also just going to do prevent default. So then what we can do now is actually pass those values down into our review form along with some of the attributes from our state. So we can actually say, let's say handle change equals handle change, and then we'll do basically the same thing for handle submit. And then I also want to pass down attributes similar to what we did in our header component. So I'm going to say airline.data.attributes. And then I also want to pass down our review object from our state. So initially that's just going to be an empty object, but then once the user starts to fill out the review form, we'll start to fill this with data. So for now, we're going to say pass down review. I'm just going to set that to review. So then back in our review form now, what we can do is, so we're taking in props into this component. So what we can do is inside of our form now, we can actually say on submit and set that equal to props.handleSubmit. And then similarly for each of our inputs now, we can actually say on change equals props.handleChange. And then we can actually set the values for these inputs as well to now be props.review.title and props.review.description. And then we can also actually populate this now with the actual airline name from attributes. So we can say props.attributes.name. And so now that we've actually set up our on-change handlers with our input fields, if we jump back over into our airline component, so we jump in here, if we, as an example, if we just console log basically like name and set that to the event.target.name, and then also say value and set that equal to event.target.value. If we jump over into our browser now and reload this page, and if we open up our console, let's see what happens now if we start to fill this out. Cool. So you can see basically that our handle change is getting triggered, and we can actually see the name and value for that input field that are being modified. So in this case, we have name, title, and then the value that's being entered into that field, and then name, description, and the value that's being entered into that field. So what we can do with that then is back in our handle change, we can basically just set this up so that as a user is filling out the form, we can just take the values from those input fields and use them to update the current value of review in our state. And so because we used that use state hook earlier, we can basically just say set review and use that to update review in our state. So we can basically set that to something like object.assign, and basically we can say we want to create an object, and then we want to update our review object, and then we basically want to update the key within our review object that's being modified actively in the form. So what we can do is say e.target.name and then update e.target.value. And then just to make sure that's working, let's actually console log what review is in our state as this value is getting modified. And then let's actually jump back in the browser and try that again. So I'm just going to jump back in the form and just update that. Looks like we got a warning, but we're just going to ignore that for now. But if we look here, we can see that basically now we're updating review in our state, and we can see that we're actually adding the appropriate values within our review object. So that takes care of our handle change method. So let's jump back over and look at our handle submit method. So for our handle submit, this is where we're actually going to submit the review to our API to actually create a new review in our database. So all we really need to do here is basically take the review that's going to get built in that review object in our state, and then combine that with the airline ID that we have in our airline object in our state, and basically combine those together and then submit that data to our API. So what we can do here is basically just grab that airline ID from our airline object. So we can just say const airline ID equals airline.data.id. And then what we want to do is basically just use Axios here and just make a post request to our API. So in this case, the URL endpoint is going to be /API/v1/reviews. And then the payload that we want to submit with this is just going to be basically our review object and then our airline ID. And then we can chain on our .then and .catch cases. And for now, I'm just going to throw a debugger in here. And one additional thing that we can do before we actually make that post request is at this point, we can actually update the default headers with Axios to actually pull in our csurf token as well. So we can actually, let's create a new variable and call it csurf token. We can set that equal to document.querySelector. And we just want to grab name equals csurf token. And then we want to grab the content from that. And then what we can do is axios.defaults.headers.common. And we can say x csurf token. and set that equal to cserve token. But so now let's try this out. And basically, if everything's working correctly, when the user submits that review form, basically our handle submit should get triggered. And at that point, we'll take the review object and the airline ID from within our state and kind of package those together and then submit that with Axios in a post request to our API. And let's actually jump over into our reviews controller. And so before we submit this, I want to make just a few small changes here. So basically, we're going to be passing through that airline ID as a param now. So what we can do is actually, we can actually set airline here and basically say airline.find by params airline ID. And then up in our create method, we can actually just say, for our new review, we want to make it airline.reviews.new. But so let's try this out now and see what happens when we submit our form. So I'm just going to fill this out. And let's see what happens when we submit that. Cool. Okay, so it looks like we're hitting our dot then, and we're getting our response back from the API. And if we look here, it looks like we are getting all the data back for that review that we just created. And we can see everything looks good. So now when we submit that form, we are able to actually take that review and submit it through our API and create a new review in the database on the Rails side of our app. And if we jump over into our console, we can take a look and we can see that we made a post request to API v1 reviews. And that's hitting our reviews controller. And then we can look and see the payload that we sent through. So we have that title and description for review. And then we also have the specific airline ID for the airline that the review is being created for. And then we can see that we created the review and it looks like everything's working. So now what we can do is actually take the data from the response that we're getting from this API request and actually use it to update some of the values in our state. So what I want to do is if we jump back over into our handle submit method, if we jump down into our .then, what I want to do is I want to take the review that we just created that we're getting back in our response object, and I want to actually add that to our array of reviews under the included key on our airline, so we don't actually have to make an additional request back to our airline endpoint to get the updated state for that. So what we can do is actually, we can say, let's create a variable and just call this included. And what we can do is basically use the spread operator to get airline.included. We can also just add response.data. And basically we'll just push this review into the array of existing reviews that we already have on airline. And then what we can do is basically just update that for airline in our state. So we can do set airline. And we can, I think we can again just use the spread operator there and just say airline and included to basically update that value in our state. And then additionally, because we've now submitted the review, I want to actually clear out the values in the review object in our state to make sure that everything is just set back to being empty. So now that we have the basic functionality of our review form set up, let's actually take care of the scoring piece now. So back over in our review form, I'm going to actually create a new variable and just call this rating options. And basically I want to create an array of all of the score options, but I'm going to do it in reverse. So we'll have 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And then what I want to do is basically just map over that. And I'm just going to say score and index. And then for each scoring option, I basically want to create a new input. And I'm going to give that a type of radio and set the value to just equal the score. And I'm going to make the name for that rating. And then we can actually, on change, let's actually just log to the console. So we'll just create an arrow function and just say console.log selected. And then we'll set the score value here to make sure everything's working. And then for each scoring option, I just want to give it a unique ID. And we can do something like just use string interpolation to say rating and then pass in the unique score value. And then I also want to create a label element, but we'll just leave that blank for now. And then because we have these two top level elements, let's actually import fragment from React. And let's actually just wrap this with a fragment. And so now what we can actually do is take that new variable and down here where we put this placeholder, we can actually just put that in there. And then let's actually just take a look at that in the browser. So I'm going to reload the page. Let's see. Oh, you know what? We need to return that value. Let's try that again. Cool. Okay, so we can see we created a like a radio button for each of those options, and now let's take a look at the console. If we click on these, we should see the appropriate score getting selected for each option. So it looks like that's all working. So what we're going to do now is configure this to basically be our star rating selection. So in order to set this up, back in our review form now, I'm going to import styled components. So I'm going to import styled from styled components. And I'm going to create some new components that we can basically use to set up our star rating within that form. So I'm going to create a const I'm going to call our rating container and just make that style.div. And then I'm going to create a new just div that we can use to wrap our rating options. So we can just call this like our rating box. And then I'm going to create a component for that as well. So we'll just call that rating box and do style.div for that. And then we can also do one for our rating title as well. And so for our rating container, this is going to be kind of the container wrapping this entire section. So I'm going to just center this. So we can do text line center for that. And then I wanted to give this thing like a little bit of a border radius. So we can do like 4 pixels. And then we can set a specific font size for this. And I also want to just put a little bit of padding on this, mostly on the top. So I'm going to do like 40 pixels on the top, and then we can do just 0 left and right. So do a little bit on the bottom as well. And I want to give this just like a light border. And then I just want to give this a background and set it to be white. But then let's replace that down below in our content. So I'm just going to swap that in here. But then within our rating box, this is where we're going to kind of set everything up for the star ratings. So I'm going to give this a background of white, and then I'm actually going to set this to use flexbox, so we can set the display to be flex. And then I'm going to do justify content center, and then I want to actually use for flex direction, we're going to set this to row reverse. And then I'm just going to set the position to relative. And then for the actual input field that we created, I'm actually going to set that to display none to actually hide the input. And then for the label that we created, we'll actually set up like an SVG for our star rating. And we're going to use basically like a trick from Codepen that I'll link below, but we're going to set it up so that we have a set of SVGs that we set up as the background image for this label element. So basically I'm going to set this to be cursor pointer. And then I'm going to give this a fixed width and height. So we'll do like 40 pixels. And then what we want to do is set a background image for this. And so for the URL that I'm going to use for this, basically I want to grab this SVG. But what we can actually do for this is, so this is going to be our star selected, and then there's also going to be star gray, and we'll also have star hover. So this will be like our 3 different star states between unselected, hovered, and selected. So what we can actually do is back in our app, we can actually just create, like inside of our airline folder, we can create a new folder and call this like stars if we want, and then we can just create a new file for each. So I'm going to create gray.js and selected.js and hover.js, let's say. And so for each of these states, we can just grab that, and then we can basically just say, so this will be for hover, and that's also hover. So we can say const hover equals, and basically what I'm going to do is just do encode URI component, and just wrap this with, I think we can just use like backticks for that, and just encode that value. And then we can export default hover to basically just set up that SVG that we want to use. And then we can do like the same thing for these other 2 use cases and just grab the SVG values for that. So we'll set up the gray star, and then we'll set up the selected. Let's set that up, and then we switch that. So we'll create selected and export default selected. But so now we have all of our stars as SVGs that we can pull into our review form, and we can actually set that as the background image for basically all the states that we want to use to get like our star rating effect. So what we can do is inside of this value, we can set the URL that we want to point this to. We can actually just do data image /SVG, and we can do plus XML, and then we have to do char set equals UTF-8. And then at this point, we can use string interpolation to actually bring in those values. So in this case, I want to make the default state gray. So let's import basically all of those. So we'll import gray from stars/gray. And then let's actually just do the same thing for hover and selected. And then we can just pull in that value here. So it'll pull in that SVG for the gray star. And then what we can do is basically set up the states for when we hover over a label and an input is not checked, and then also for when an input is actually checked. So it'll set the different states between an unselected star, a hovered over star, and a selected star rating. So we can do input checked. And in this case, we can set the background image to selected. And then we can also set input not checked. And for this, we can set the SVG background image to be our hover SVG. And so what we can do now is grab that rating box, and we can replace our rating box wrapper here. And then we also need to, for our label, we want to also set background repeat to no repeat. And we want to set background position to be centered. And then we just want to reduce the background size a little bit so we can make it like 70%. But then let's take a look and see what that looks like now. Okay, so now we have our stars, and you can see we have our different SVG states. So we have our gray SVG, we have our hover state SVG, and then we have selected as well. but we won't see that yet because we aren't actually modifying the state for when we actually click this. So let's actually set that up now. So let's create a set score method inside of our main airline component that we can use to actually set the score when we select that star rating. So inside of my airline component, I'm going to create a new method, and I'm just going to call this set rating. And so for this method, similar to what we did above, we're going to pass in the event, but I also want to pass in the score as well as an additional argument for this method. So inside of here, I'm going to do e.preventDefault. And then what we can do is take this method and pass it down to our review form. So we'll say set rating equals set rating, and then inside of our review form, if we go back to where we were setting up our rating options for our input, we can actually basically just set an on click here and set that to props.setRating. But then what I want to do is, so inside of our rating options here, we're currently looping through each different score. So for each score, I want to basically do bind and pass in that score as that additional argument so we can use it inside that method. And then additionally, what we can do for our input here is we can actually say, we can set checked and set that equal to basically, we can check if props.review.score. So if the score value for the review that gets set when we set the rating is equal to the score of a specific input when we loop through it, then we'll set that value as checked. So we'll actually be able to visibly set that star rating at that point. So back in our set rating method, let's just throw a debugger in there. And let's see what happens if we refresh the page and then we try to set a rating. So I'm going to clear out the console and then let's just try to see what happens if we set 4 stars. So we hit our debugger and we can see that we're passing through the specific score value, and we also have the event. So if we look at this, we can see we have our score. We can see that we have the specific element that we're targeting as well. So back in our set review method, let's actually just modify this so we can update our state to actually add the score into the review object in our state. So similar to what we did above, we can use this set review method that we get from using that use state hook. So we can just do set review. And all we have to do for this is basically update our review. So we'll do, we can use the spread operator and say review, and then just pass in the score that's getting passed through in our method here. And so now if we refresh the page, when we select a rating now, it should actually set. So now it's actually getting set for our review. So we can actually select and modify a rating value for this review. And what we should see at this point is when we actually create the review now, we should see that get passed through to our backend on the Rails side with a score. So if we submit that, if we look, if we check, we can see in the value that got passed through that the score is now getting passed through along with the title and description, and we can see the rating that I selected getting set as the score for that review. So it looks like everything is working for creating new reviews now. So at this point, let's actually go ahead and finish styling up the rest of the content for our review form component. So if we look at this, we have, we want to basically create like a wrapper component and a field component, as well as probably like a submit button component that we can add some style to. So I'm going to create some additional values in here and just say field, so that equal to style.div. I also want to create our wrapper div, and I also want to create a submit button. So this will be a button actually. And then I also want to create like a header or like a headline for this kind of title section of our form. So let's actually create a headline as well, and that'll just be a div. But then for my field, I basically want to give this like a border radius. So we'll keep using consistently just that 4 pixel border radius. And then I want to style the inputs that are going to be inside of this actually. So let's set like a fixed min height for these. That will make like 50 pixels. And then we'll use the same border radius. So we'll do 4 pixels. And then I want to just give this like a little border. So we'll do 1 pixel solid. And then do like that light border color. And then I also just want to give this like a little bit of margin and padding. So we can do like 12 pixels, 0, and like 12 pixels maybe. And then I want to do a similar thing for text area because I think we'll probably end up making the description like a text area instead of an input field. But I'm going to give this a width of 100%, and then we'll give this like a min height that's a little bit bigger than our input field. And then similarly, I want to give it the same border radius that we used above. And then actually I'm going to give it like the same border, margin, and padding as well. So let's grab that and we can replace that down below for all the elements that will be our field. So we can just basically swap out all the wrappers around our inputs. And then for my wrapper, for this, I want to basically just set the background of our form to be white. And then I want to give this just like a little bit of padding. And let's just see how that looks initially. So I'm going to just throw that in for our wrapper. And then for my submit button, let's give this a color of, we'll make this white for the color, and then we'll give it a background. Initially, let's just make this black for the background. And then similar to above, I'm going to give this the same border radius. And then let's give it a little bit of padding, and let's set a specific font size for this and also give it cursor pointer. And then I'm going to give it a little bit of transition. So we'll do ease in, out, make that like 0.1 seconds. And then let's actually set a hover state for it as well, where we'll just flip the color and background color. So we can say background white, color black basically. And then I want to set a specific border for both the hover and non-hover state that matches the background. So let's throw that down below for our submit button. And then for my headline, let's give this some padding. And then I'm going to give this a font size and just make it like 20 pixels. And then maybe we can just give this a font weight to make it a little bit bolder. We can pull that in down below. And then for my rating title, we can also give this like a font size of 20 pixels. We'll give it padding bottom to put a little bit of space between it and the star ratings. And then we can also make this bold to match the headline. But so let's pull that down there. And then let's take a look and see what this looks like so far. So a little bit better. Let's actually, for the submit button, let's give that a width of 100%. And let's do the same thing for the input fields. And then let's actually give the wrapper a background to make it darker. And let's see what that looks like. Getting a little bit better. Let's see if so let's give the submit button like a little bit of margin above it. And let's actually make our wrapper, let's give this a height of 100 view height, and let's actually give it padding top of 100 pixels. And let's adjust the width of our input fields a little bit. And then for the wrapper background, let's actually make this just like solid black. And then let's actually give our submit button initially a border that is white. So the color will be white, the border will be white, and the background will be black. And then for hovering, it'll be background white, color white. Oh, we don't want that. So we want color to be black in that case, and then border of white. So let's see what that looks like now. So it's starting to look a little bit better. And then we need to adjust the headline as well. So let's give that, we'll make the color white for that as well. That's starting to look pretty good. So let's actually, for my headline, the font size still looks kind of small. Let's see. Let's try to beef that up a little bit. And then let's try to, for the rating box, let's see if we give this a little bit of like margin on top to just try to space this out a little bit better. Or I guess let's, for the inputs, maybe just do, let's see. Let's see if we do top, right, bottom. So we only add margin on the bottom there. Let's see what that looks like. That looks a little bit more evenly spaced out between the different blocks. But so now that's starting to come together. So we have our review section set up where we can now add basically, a title, a description, and then we can set the rating. But now we can actually fully submit that with all of the appropriate values. And we can see on the back end here that will submit with all of that data and actually create the new review in our database. So now just to recap, what we have right now is basically we have our homepage where we have a list of all of our airlines, and what we've set up now is basically the ability to go into the individual airline page and actually see basically information on that airline, as well as the ability to create a new review for any of these airlines.